Ramen, the lifeblood of cheapskates, workaholics, and homebodies alike, is deeply entrenched in the modern diet, and I dare say an overlooked part of daily life. You might know it as either a budget comfort food or a quintessential traditional Japanese food along with sushi. If only it were that simple. It's quite the long story, so allow me to enlighten you. It's the early 12th century. The Silk Road was booming, China was in its golden age, and Buddhism was going places, particularly to Japan. During this time, Buddhist monks who traveled from Japan to China were exposed to Chinese foods and were inspired to make them in their temples. This manifested itself in the form of soba, a noodle made of buckwheat, and was a big hit among the people. Noodles were among many other foods that spread from China to Japan that form our knowledge of Japanese cuisine today, such as soy sauce and miso, which use the fermentation of soybeans to make flavor. These were essentially the precursors of the ramen we know today. It's also worth noting that the overarching influence of Buddhist and Shintoist doctrines led most of Japanese society to shun meat eating, preserving a relatively bland vegetable diet for many centuries. During the 17th century, the imperial government moved the nation's capital from Kyoto to Edo during the Tokugawa shogunate, slowly building infrastructure and urbanizing the backwater fishing village. This led to an increase in laborers who looked for work in the city, and most importantly, an appetite for a quick, hot meal. A nice bowl of hot soba at one of these food stalls in the dead of night checks off all of those boxes, so it didn't come as a surprise when the government had to outlaw night sales for safety reasons as it became way too popular. Meanwhile, Nagasaki flourished as a cultural hub as it was closer to China, Japan, and the world. The Portuguese, Dutch, and Chinese imported their cultures as well as foods into Japan, including cakes, tempura, pork, and Chinese cuisine, which would come to play an important role in laying the groundwork for ramen to flourish in Japan. Even after Japan closed off its borders to the west for fear of Western influence during this time, the seed of these acquired tastes and cultures in Japan was planted. After being effectively secluded from the world in centuries, our good friend Matthew Perry decided that it would be a good day to kindly open up some ports. It was an arrangement that the Japanese disliked, but they also realized that they could not resist them, because we can see how that went down. If you can't beat them, join them. Thus, Japan entered a period of rapid modernization. As Asia's first industrializing nation at the time, Japan saw an influx of Chinese immigrants who wanted to learn how the Japanese managed to modernize successfully. They found work as laborers, students, or translators between Japan and foreign countries and settled in urban areas where there is a demand for more cheap, flavorful, filling food. Over time, ramen carts and shops were set up around the country that served a noodle dish based on the Chinese la mian to accommodate the diversifying population. At this moment, the exact origin of ramen is still disputed as ramen formed differently in different regions, but the most famous story is from the opening of a ramen shop, Rairaken, which opened in the Asakusa district of Tokyo in 1910 to meet the demand of blue-collar workers. Here, the restaurant ramen that we know today takes one of its initial forms. Noodles prepared in alkaline water, chashu, naruto, and nori sitting in a soya sauce broth. Throughout Japan's modernization and successful campaigns against the Russians and the Chinese, the European diet was highly esteemed by modern scholars such as Fukuzawa Yukichi, who aggressively promoted the incorporation of meat eating, bread, and dairy into the Japanese diet. He partially attributed European success in imperialism to the eating choices that they made, which enabled them to be faster, taller, and stronger than the Japanese. The Navy gradually incorporated bread and meat into their diets to stave off vitamin deficiencies, and even the emperor publicly endorsed the act of meat eating in 1872 when he broke a millennia-long taboo on consuming meat. The culinary association between Western diet and civilization doesn't end here. At the same time, Chinese and even Japanese food was associated with the backwards culture of bad hygiene and smell found in Chinese kitchens, especially among the country's elite. On the other hand, good hygiene became a marker of Western cuisine. Nevertheless, the flavorful features of Chinese cuisine and ramen were widely appreciated by the working class. Interesting, isn't it? It's almost like a love-hate relationship. And then World War II happened. The worst famines of the war struck Japan, killing over 1 million people. Lines for food became miles long, and people could no longer sustain the diet that they were accustomed to before the war, as the main source of rice, their colonies, had been lost. Restaurants and ramen became a relic of a bygone age of imperialism and prosperity, outlawed due to the scarcity of food. What remained was a strict rationing system sponsored by wheat imports from the US. The black market, which thrived off the diversion of these imports, flourished as rations were clearly not enough to fill people's stomachs. But why wheat? Well, obviously because Americans were nice and decided to help out some people in need. Initially, wheat imports to Japan were scarce, and America only exported more food to Japan after they realized that Japan and Korea, being so close to newly communist China, could easily fall to communism if the hunger crisis escalated to social unrest. By marketing American food as well as their school lunches to the Japanese as more nutritious, meat, wheat, and dairy slowly became a mainstay of the Japanese diet. As you can see, the cultural association between wheat and nutrition persisted a century later. But what if there was something better than wheat and bread? Enter this failing ex-convict, Taiwanese businessman who lived in Japanese-occupied Taiwan. For Momo Andofuku, it's safe to say his life wasn't going well at all. That was until he established a small salt-producing company in Osaka and thought, we don't like bread, so why don't we make noodles instead? So he did it himself. After all, peace would come to the world when people have enough to eat, and noodles were a perfect compromise for preserving culture and making use of the flour imports. What ingenuity! After years of research, failures, and a stroke of inspiration, he realized that noodles could not only be placed in alkaline water and deep fried to maintain its texture and taste, it could also be packaged into styrofoam cups. The cheap, simple manufacturing process of cup noodles and instant ramen was an instant success, especially as many people started working outside of the home, fueling the demand for quick, easy calories. Over time, this phenomenon spread worldwide, especially in American prisons, where ramen has become a popular commodity among inmates. As a new generation of youth working in white-collar jobs was raised on the boom of instant ramen, a response to fast food emerged, and the profile of ramen was raised on the food of humble laborers to a high-end cultural phenomenon. This was also fueled by the government's funding of the domestic industry that featured different types of ramen unique to different regions, like the miso ramen in Hokkaido or the tonkotsu ramen in Kyushu. The nationalization of ramen was pushed further by the Yokohama Ramen Museum that opened in 1994, pushing the story of ramen further into national and international consciousness, leading us to, well, where we are today. It's crazy to think that behind just one food, a rabbit hole's worth of stories, cultures, and lessons to be learned are found. From the Chinese-style noodle making and fermentation that first arrived in Japan, then furthered by the blend of Western cultures, politics, and peoples, looking at the evolution of food puts a fresh perspective into how I view history, and whether it's being simply culturally informed or emulating the thriftiness of Ando, gastronomy leaves many lessons for us to learn. Seeing food as the record of events and impacts before us has definitely changed the way that I see ramen and history as a whole. So dear viewer, next time you eat a bowl of ramen, know that a long, complex story lies in its depths.